Picture this. You're standing in the middle of a frozen wilderness so vast it feels endless. Snow stretches in every direction, swallowing the horizon. The wind cuts through you like a blade, and the temperature has dropped to -40. Your breath freezes the moment it leaves your mouth. Your fingers are so numb you can barely feel whether they're still attached to your hands. Every step hurts. Every second feels like survival itself is hanging by a thread. And yet, despite the cold, the danger, and the isolation, you're about to trade a handful of metal goods, some knives, a kettle, maybe a gun, for enough beaver pelts to buy a mansion back in Europe. Not a cabin. Not a modest home. A mansion. This wasn't luck or chance. This wasn't a quaint exchange between trappers and traders. This was the beginning of an empire, built on fur, blood, alliances, betrayal, and an animal that nearly vanished from an entire continent. And it all started because wealthy people in Paris wanted fancy hats. Most people think the fur trade was just a small chapter in Canada's history, something harmless and almost charming. A few trappers catching beavers, some trading posts along rivers, some winter coats, and that's it. But that version of the story is dangerously incomplete. The fur trade didn't just happen in Canada's past. It created it. It shaped the borders of North America. It decided which empires would rise and which would fall. It determined where cities would exist and where nothing would. It forged alliances between nations and destroyed entire cultures. It transformed ecosystems, rewired economies, and permanently altered the relationship between indigenous peoples and European powers. And all of it revolved around one animal, the beaver. It sounds absurd at first. How could a rodent that builds dams possibly change the course of history? But that's the point. This story isn't about the beaver itself. It's about what human beings were willing to do to get their hands on its fur. Once you understand why beaver fur became so valuable, everything else, the violence, the greed, the expansion, the suffering, suddenly makes sense. To understand that, you have to go back to Europe in the early 1500s. This was a time of dramatic transformation. The Renaissance was reshaping how people thought about art, science, power, and identity. Exploration was expanding the known world, and wealth was becoming something to be displayed. Among Europe's elite, fashion wasn't just about clothing. It was about status. And one trend rose above all others: felt hats made from beaver fur. Beaver felt was dense, waterproof, and incredibly durable. A beaver hat could survive years of rain and snow while still looking elegant. Kings wore them. Nobles wore them. Anyone who wanted to signal power and wealth needed one. If you didn't own a beaver felt hat, you weren't important. But Europe had a problem. By the time this fashion exploded, Europe had already hunted its own beavers almost to extinction. Centuries of trapping for fur, meat, and castoreum had wiped them out across much of the continent. Demand soared. Supply collapsed. And when markets face that kind of imbalance, merchants look elsewhere. That's when they turned their eyes toward North America, particularly its cold northern regions. In those harsh climates, beavers grew the thickest, most luxurious fur imaginable. To European merchants, this wasn't wilderness. It was untapped wealth. The French moved first. In the late 1500s and early 1600s, French explorers pushed into what's now eastern Canada. What they found seemed unbelievable. Rivers and streams filled with beaver dams. Forests alive with movement. Pelts so abundant they appeared endless. But there was a fatal problem. The French didn't know how to survive here. They didn't understand the land, the winters, or the trap lines. They didn't know which rivers froze safely, which forests could kill you, or how quickly the cold could end a life. Without help, they would fail. That help came from the indigenous peoples who had lived on this land for thousands of years. These nations already had complex economies and trade networks long before Europeans arrived. They understood animal behavior, seasonal cycles, and survival in extreme conditions. They didn't need Europeans, but Europeans desperately needed them. Indigenous trappers knew where the beavers lived, when the fur was thickest, how to trap efficiently, and how to prepare pelts properly. They knew how to survive winter. They knew the land in ways no map ever could. The French quickly realized this wasn't an empty land waiting to be claimed. It was a world with rules, diplomacy, and power structures. They couldn't just demand furs. They had to build relationships. They learned indigenous languages. They participated in ceremonies. They exchanged gifts and smoked pipes to formalize alliances. Some traders married indigenous women, forming family ties that bound cultures together. Out of these unions emerged the Métis, a new people with their own identity, language, and traditions blending indigenous and European worlds. Europeans brought trade goods that transformed life almost overnight. Metal knives that stayed sharp longer than stone. Iron axes that changed woodworking forever. Copper kettles that didn't crack in fire. Glass beads in colors never seen before. And most significantly, guns. Firearms altered hunting, warfare, and power dynamics completely. But indigenous peoples were not naive. They understood value. They negotiated hard. They rejected bad deals. They played European rivals against each other. They knew what their furs were worth. Still, something dangerous was unfolding beneath the surface. Dependency. Once a community relied on guns, it needed ammunition. Once it relied on metal tools, it needed replacements. To get those things, it needed furs. That meant more trapping. More trapping meant competition for territory. Competition led to conflict. Conflict required more weapons. The cycle fed itself, tightening its grip year after year. The French organized their operations through trading companies that evolved into the Northwest Company, pushing deep into the interior and living among indigenous communities. The English, watching from across the Atlantic, wanted in. In 1670, the English crown granted the Hudson's Bay Company exclusive trading rights over all land draining into Hudson Bay, millions of square miles handed to a private corporation. It was a corporate empire unlike anything the world had seen. The Hudson's Bay Company took a different approach. Instead of going inland, they built massive fortified posts along the coast and waited. Indigenous traders would bring the furs to them. Now two systems collided. French traders paddled deep into the wilderness, forming personal relationships. English traders waited behind walls of timber and stone. Competition became ruthless. Better prices. More gifts. Credit systems that trapped trappers in debt. Sabotage. Lies. Violence. The men who powered this system paid a heavy price. French voyageurs paddled massive birch-bark canoes thousands of miles, carrying loads weighing over 180 pounds across portages. They survived on pemmican and willpower, singing to keep rhythm as they paddled. On the English side, workers from Scotland's Orkney Islands lived at isolated posts where supply ships arrived once a year. They endured months of darkness, hunger, and loneliness. Starvation was always a threat. As the trade expanded, disease followed. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and tuberculosis tore through indigenous communities. Entire villages disappeared in weeks. Elders died, taking generations of knowledge with them. The trade continued anyway. As beavers disappeared in the east, traders pushed west into the Great Lakes, the prairies, the Rockies, and eventually the Pacific. Explorers crossed the continent. Men died. Others grew rich. By the early 1800s, competition turned violent. Raids, burnings, and ambushes became common. In 1816, the Battle of Seven Oaks left bodies in the snow. Profits fell as costs rose. Finally, in 1821, the Hudson's Bay Company absorbed the Northwest Company. The monopoly was complete. Indigenous trappers lost their bargaining power overnight. Then fashion changed. Silk hats replaced beaver felt. Beaver populations collapsed. The Golden Age ended. The Hudson's Bay Company adapted, selling supplies to settlers and evolving into a retail empire. The United States expanded west. Borders were drawn. Territories divided. In 1869, the company sold most of its land to Canada. The fur trade was no longer the engine of empire. But it didn't disappear. It faded. Indigenous communities were left with disease, dependency, lost land, and cultural disruption. Residential schools followed. Treaties were broken. And yet resilience endured. The Métis emerged as a recognized people. Beaver populations slowly recovered. Trapping survived as tradition. Today, the beaver is Canada's national symbol, stamped onto coins. There's irony in that. An animal nearly hunted to extinction now represents a nation. But it's also fitting. The fur trade was never just about fur. It was about power, markets, ambition, and consequence. A hat in Paris reshaped a continent. And we're still living with the aftermath. That's the story they don't teach in schools. Not the neat version with dates and company names, but the real one. Messy. Complicated. Brutal. Transformative. The version where real people made real choices that changed the world. And now you know. If this made you see history differently, go check out the next video.